It would be so embarrassing for the Orthodox if rather than we were always on the defense, if Orthodox for once had to defend their doctrines.
That's absolutely right.
Today I'll be doing a response video to Trent Horn, William Albrecht, and Jimmy Akin, all of whom I deeply respect.
If we had Ybarra debate Ubi Petrus, and rather than Ybarra defend the papacy, we had to have Ubi Petrus defend Orthodox ecclesiology, he would get smoked.
That's absolutely right. Orthodox cannot just say, well, the data doesn't support the Vatican I view of the papacy. If the Orthodox held themselves to the same stringent standards, they'd see that many of their own doctrines and practices are either novel or they have developed over time.
I do understand what Trent's saying here. Like, you can't just be arguing for one point as if that's going to just seal the deal for one paradigm. But most people that are approaching the sort of Catholic Orthodox conversation, they've already eliminated all the other options. I mean, you're not going to be talking about Vatican I to a spiritual seeker who's wrestling with, is Jesus real or not? Is the church true? Is the New Testament true? You're not really getting into primacy, patriarchs, Vatican I, because their understanding of reality just hasn't gotten to that point. If you're already talking about Vatican I, generally it's people who are on the fence. Is it Roman Catholicism or is it Holy Orthodoxy?
Just as some Protestants think that refuting Orthodoxy and Catholicism makes them winners by default, some Eastern Orthodox do the same thing. They will try to argue that Catholicism entails historical contradictions concerning doctrines like the papacy.
So I do understand his point that there needs to be not just a negative case, this is why they are wrong or have distortions, but rather there needs to be much more of a positive case. And there are many books out there. I think many more need to be written. One example would be Craig Truglia's book, The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. This book is not a negative, just trying to take out Roman Catholicism, even though the title might make it sound kind of like that. In reality, this book is actually historically giving a positive case for the conciliar model of the church, where patriarchs between the different ancient apostolic sees, they are working together. And so he demonstrates that really Rome is inheriting the shrine of Peter and Paul. This is where they died. They sanctified the city really in their blood. Yes, it's the biggest city, and therefore it becomes the biggest see in the ancient church, but it's been sanctified by the two chief apostles. Ultimately, the bishops inherit the office of Peter, as we'll see here shortly. Whereas this ancient sees like Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, these are Petrine sees. Peter helped start them, but they are actually apostolic headquarters that help the church stay organized and be unified together. They participate more so in the mission of Peter. Another way to think of it is like this. You know, an abbot of a monastery, he's sacramentally equal to his brother monks and priests. But canonically, the way that the framework of a monastery is set up, he is their father, he is their abbot, and they owe him obedience. Sacramentally, he is equal to them, but they've given him authority to play this role in the monastery, and that's much closer to how the Orthodox would view what a patriarch is and what a pope is, which is the same word, by the way.
Moreover, the alleged historical contradictions that the Orthodox raise against Catholics also comes up against them as well. Orthodox cannot just say, well, the data doesn't support the Vatican I view of the papacy. All right, well, the historical data doesn't support your view of the papacy either.
Most people that I talk to are aware of St. Ignatius of Antioch's arguments when they read his letters. He gives us a whole understanding of what the ancient ecclesiology framework was. He goes, laity report to deacons, deacons report to presbyters or priests, and presbyters report to bishops, and bishops to God. This is the hard apostolic DNA of the church. And so Ignatius' ecclesiology doesn't harmonize well with Vatican I. And St. Ignatius is probably the biggest witness to ancient church ecclesiology and what the apostles handed on to us.
Eric Ibarra shows in his book, The Papacy, Revisiting the Debate Between Catholics and Orthodox, the evidence from the first millennium shows that the popes themselves and the Eastern patriarchs viewed the papacy as having a divinely established authority that goes beyond what is given to the other patriarchs.
Father Richard Price, the translator of the Ecumenical Councils, he often notes that the East never signed off that the Pope was something different than a patriarch. Rather, they always viewed him as a senior bishop.
What role, if any, did papal infallibility and papal supremacy play at Chalcedon?
Well, the Easterners didn't believe in it. They recognized the Pope was the senior bishop in the church. He must be listened to with respect. Of course, this didn't mean that they thought the Roman had any notion of papal infallibility.
Elijah Yassi asks, why did the bishops in Chalcedon feel they needed to judge Theodoret if Leo had already reinstated him?
Well, they didn't recognize Roman jurisdiction in the eastern provinces. So Leo's reinstating for them was not decisive. A decision has to be made in the East.
Modern day Eastern Orthodoxy, I am sorry, but modern day Eastern Orthodoxy cannot deal with these texts in any coherent manner whatsoever.
He is the first bishop among the bishops. He's the first patriarch among the patriarchs. He is the first high priest among the high priests. There's always this protos among in a conciliar manner. And so they're viewing his office as being patriarchal in nature. He is a patriarch. His office is not something different above that. It doesn't like mutate and become higher than that.
Modern day Eastern Orthodoxy have rejected the papacy. They have rejected the faith of their fathers. In order to reject the papacy, they've got to rewrite history. They've got to reinterpret the early church fathers. They've got to reinterpret the Bible, and they got to reinterpret councils as well. And they've done it to all. And we're barely beginning our examination here of Second Nicene.
Did the Eastern Church believe in papal supremacy at the council? Some are going to say that the papal claims were presented at the Seventh Ecumenical Council.
No one disputed that the Pope is the first in honor of all the bishops. But what was not accepted in Constantinople was that he had any authority over them. He could not dictate to them. But first in honor, absolutely, that was absolutely not disputed.
In Eastern Orthodoxy, they accept the Seventh Ecumenical Council as authoritative, and yet it holds to the papal claims, which is inconsistent because most Eastern Orthodox right now reject the papal claims, namely papal supremacy and papal infallibility, which go hand in hand. Father Richard Price, outstanding scholar, interviewed him on the channel many times, who translated the Acts, who deals with the actual documents and reads the languages here. He says of this,
what was not accepted in Opal was that he had any authority over them. He could not dictate to them. But first in honor, absolutely, that was absolutely not disputed.
Here's where I think there would be a difference and a disagreement, where Orthodox generally viewed the Bishop of Rome as the protos, that means the first among the patriarchs. And so the nature of his office is patriarchal. There isn't any kind of new office or supreme office above that. Yeah, does it have implications because you're the first among them? Yes, it has certain types of responsibilities. But the Pope called himself a patriarch. The word Pope means patriarch. The house that he lived in was called the house of a patriarch. He is a patriarch. There is not something higher than that. However, because he's the first among the patriarchs as far as the ordering, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople comes in to be a part of that. Other sees are ordered within that eventually, participating in the mission of Peter. But because he's the protos, that means the first among the patriarchs, there are certain types of responsibilities. And that's why Apostolic Canon 34 does give the Bishop of Rome some responsibilities as far as hearing appeals from people in different places around the world.
Matthew 16, Jesus obviously institutes Peter as the Pope. When in history did Christ become a liar? Christ promised, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it."
A lot of times when Catholics talk about the papacy having a divine origin, they always go back to Matthew 16. Now, Orthodox might be okay with like patriarchs and synods and councils having this kind of quasi-divine character, so we have to be careful how we talk about the word divine. What Jesus made into Peter, he made into all of the bishops as well. And so, yeah, he gives Peter a set of keys. The bishops get the keys. Yeah, he makes Peter into a rock. The bishops are a part of the foundation, the rock of the church, as we see in the book of Revelation. So everything that Peter is, the bishops are.
We know all the trickery that our Eastern Orthodox friends try to bring up. We know church history, and unfortunately this doesn't work. If someone does not hold fast to this unity of Peter, can he imagine that he still holds the faith? If he should desert the chair of Peter upon whom the church was built, can he still be confident that he is in the church?
When you get into Cyprian, he sees the bishop representing Peter. He is truly Peter's successor and sits on Peter's chair. Now, this is what Father Lawrence Cleanwork says in his Broken Body on St. Cyprian. The casual reader has no concept of the Eucharistic Petrine ecclesiology. That's a big phrase. We'll have to unpack that, which Cyprian took for granted. We'll come across passages that may sound decidedly Roman Catholic. He strongly stresses the fact that Peter is the rock on which the church is built. However, the expression chair of Peter was applied by Cyprian to every bishop. He writes, "Our Lord determines the honor of a bishop and the order of his church when he speaks in the gospel and says to Peter, I say unto you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Matthew 16, the bishops. From there, through the changes of times and successions, the ordination of bishops and the plan of the church flow on, so that the church is founded upon the bishops. The foundation is the apostles built on Christ. And every act of the church is regulated by these same prelates. Since then, this is founded upon divine law. They who have departed from the church, that would be presbyters who were leaving the bishops for heresy, not allow the church to recall and bring back the lapse. There is one God, one Christ, one church, one chair, founded by the voice of the Lord on the rock. Another altar cannot be set up, nor a new priesthood made besides the one altar and the one priesthood. Whoever gathers elsewhere scatters. What's St. Cyprian saying? Well, some people will be like, oh, the one chair, that must be the Pope's chair in Rome. But in this context, that's not what he's talking about. There's many altars around the whole world, but in many ways, they are one altar. They are the Eucharistic altar. St. Augustine will call it the one holy mountain where we're all gathered. When we all gather for the Eucharist, even though it's many altars, it's just one altar. In the same way, there's one priesthood with one chair. That is the chair of Peter, which is the chair of the bishop. It kind of reminds you of when Jesus says that the Pharisee sits on the chair of Moses. Moses wasn't around anymore, but there was symbolically one chair, but there were many chairs that the Pharisees sat on to teach the faith. Same concept, very similar. St. Gregory of Nyssa follows the same kind of thinking. Through Peter, gave to the bishops the keys of the heavenly honors. Now, none of this is saying that all of Roman Catholic theology is wrong on this point, because they will official Roman Catholic theology admits these points, that the bishops have the keys. But there's so many people online and many Catholic apologists who forget this. Oh, Peter alone received the keys, when the fathers are very clear that all of the bishops receive the keys. St. Augustine of Hippo says this: the succession of priests keeps me in the Catholic Church, the universal church, beginning from the very seat of the apostle Peter, to whom the Lord, after his resurrection, gave it in charge to feed his sheep, down to the present episcopate. He goes from Peter feeding the sheep through the apostles to the bishops. Also, I think a good case can be made in Dr. Michael Barber's work connecting Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. He makes a good case that this text is primarily about instituting a royal priesthood and Peter as high priest, and that the keys are the keys to the sanctuary, and that all of this language is priestly language. And so what is he instituting? He's instituting a new priesthood, a new high priest, and a new temple. So this is a great apologetic against Protestants who reject an ordained priesthood, but it does de-emphasize over-papalizing Matthew 16. And so what he makes Peter, he makes him a high priest after the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is the order and priesthood of Jesus Christ. What happens next in the narrative, in the story? Peter oversees the apostles, and then they become who he is. The apostles go out to all of the world, right? And they oversee sanctuaries with their keys. And so you have sanctuaries all over the world. You have temples all over the world. It makes you think of the Gospel of John, when Jesus says to the Samaritans, hey, your people worship on that mountain. We worship in Jerusalem. Again, that's where Christ set it up. But there's going to come a day where there are temples and access points everywhere around the world. And so every apostle becomes a high priest. The bishop inherits this. And I'm not making this up, because it is very popular for the church fathers to call the bishop high priest, with the presbyters being priests, and what else? The deacons being the Levitical ministers. Just like baptism fulfills circumcision and the Eucharist fulfills Passover, so the three orders of the New Testament, bishop, presbyter, and deacon, fulfill the Old Testament offices of high priest, priest, and Levitical minister. And so you see this fulfillment within the covenant framework, and this really is the Orthodox framework. There's a federation of churches, and these high priests are all in communion with one another. Of course, they develop a sense of administration above that, or within that, so that they can stay unified and keep all of these sanctuaries together in communion with the whole church. And so patriarchs, or Catholicos, or metropolitans, whoever's the head of your community, is seeking communion with one another. to establish a global communion. Of course, it's already established when they're all in harmony and faith and liturgy and practice. But once that begins getting disrupted by heresy, then you're going to have a disruption in communion.
We have two communities, Catholic and Orthodox, that were originally united.
Yeah.
Now they're in a state of separation. Here we have a situation that's analogous to the split between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. Israel is originally a confederacy of 12 tribes. The northern kingdom still needs to worship in Jerusalem. The Samaritans disagreed with that. They want to say the temple is not in Jerusalem, it's on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. God eventually chose Jerusalem to be the site of his temple, and all of Israel needed to go to Jerusalem to worship. So what we have is two communities that were originally one that have now separated. And one of them has a particular institution, namely the temple, whereas the other that is in separation does not have the temple. The northern tribes that have seceded from union don't have the institution of the temple, and they have become mistaken. Notice the parallels, Catholic and Orthodox. One of them has this institution, the papacy, and the other acknowledges it, but has a different understanding. So which group is God more likely to guide into a correct understanding of the institution? Is he more likely to guide into a correct understanding the group that has the institution, or the group that is in separation from the institution?
Now, I think it's interesting that he uses the example of Samaria and Judea and the clash of the two temples and the separation of the tribes. Here's why it's interesting is that that's a great case against Protestantism, because they don't have the sanctuary. They do not have bishops with apostolic succession. They do not have the Eucharist. All of those things that we would say that make up apostolic Christianity, Protestantism doesn't really have that. And so the Samaritan analogy fits them much more closely because they don't actually have a sanctuary. Orthodoxy does have the sanctuary, and that's because you should really carry the historical reality farther. Jesus says to the Samaritan woman that this temple in Judea will go global, essentially. So they're not going to say, oh, this mountain or that mountain is the centrality of worship. It's not Jerusalem, it's not Rome, it's not Antioch, it's not Samaria. Rather, the whole globe is on fire with worship for God, and there are sanctuaries set up.
Whenever the Samaritan woman asks him, are we going to go to, do proskynesis at Gerizim, or are we going to go do it at Jerusalem when the Messiah comes? And he says, everyone will do it in spirit and in truth. The axis mundi, the meeting place of God with man, will no longer be limited to one mountain or this mountain, but there will be multiple places where Christians can gather in the presence of God and do the actions that would be accorded with meeting God in a place. The sense is clearly that those who render proskynesis to God engage in cultic worship. We're going to Jerusalem to proskynesis.
Yeah,
Whenever we say we're going to Jerusalem to do that, we're saying we're going to do all the things that we would be included in temple worship.
The whole world lit up with worship for God, with the bishop overseeing that sanctuary, as St. Ignatius of Antioch articulates, with the keys of the sanctuary. All the bishops are the new Eliakims, who are the priests who have the keys. And so what happens between the East and the West, unfortunately, after 1,000 years of being unified, is that as one of the bishops, as one of the high priests, viewed himself as significantly higher up than the rest. And this is really the warning that we see in St. Gregory the Great, that if one bishop views himself as above all the other bishops, he will fall. He'll fall like a star out of the heavens. The bishop is the high priest, as the fathers describe. Now, there can be many high priests, and they can have a different ordering among the high priests for administrative unity. But no, the bishop is the high priest in the hard sense. And so we need to really make sure that we take these typologies of the Old Testament and we carry along them through the New Testament, and taking them through Matthew 16 and Peter is totally fine with Patriarch primacy in the New Testament. But that carries on ultimately to the bishop in a hard sense. And this follows again through the article that we just went through with Michael Barber, which describes this hard connection between Isaiah 22, Matthew 16, and priestly language. Again, I deeply respect William Albrecht and Trent Horn and Jimmy Aiken and many other Catholics who I hold, much in common with. But oftentimes when they seek to sort of take out orthodoxy, oftentimes they're not really considering how typology can actually go the other way and can flush out in a different way, and how the conciliar manner of the ancient church can also be an amazing counter response. I would also say this, that when you consider all of the other parts of sacred tradition, that if you compare the Holy Orthodox Church versus the Roman Catholic Church, let's say in your mind, oh man, I could see that both of these ecclesiologies could be true. They're both possible. Okay, well, which one is the more stable bearer of sacred tradition? I mean, today, if you were to think about what an Orthodox America would look like versus a Roman Catholic America would look like 100 years out, which one do you think is going to look more stable? Which one can you even imagine what it's going to look like? I can't do that with Roman Catholicism because it's pretty topsy-turvy. They've sort of unhinged themselves from apostolic tradition. This is why they can't do synodality. Synodality, if it gets implemented in the Roman Catholic Church, could really spin out of control. And it's already been doing that to a certain extent because Germany has already been experimenting with synodality. Synodality in the Roman Catholic Church, while it's unhinged from apostolic tradition, is going to go haywire. Because, yeah, each of these regions, each of these synods, local synods, are going to start doing whatever they want because they're unhinged from the paradigm of the fathers, unhinged from the paradigm of apostolic tradition. Yeah, could our functioning of synodality and primacy be healthier? Sure. But look at the first millennium. Could have been healthier then too. Won't be perfectly healthy until Christ's foot touches the ground at his return, his parousia. Well, guys, thanks for jumping in. Not an easy topic to jump into and talk about, but expect other videos like this to address this topic because it's a pretty loaded one. I understand it's not easy to grasp at first for those who are just kind of jumping in as newbies who haven't explored Orthodox ecclesiology and how it's all set up. So I hope these series of videos and my responses will be helpful for you. Please pray for me and my family that we can do this in a form of love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness, all the fruit of the Holy Spirit. All right, guys, God bless. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye.